The Hyborian Age. Nothing in this article is to be considered as an attempt to advance any theory in opposition to accepted history. It is simply a fictional background for which a series of fiction stories. When I began writing Conan's stories a few years ago, I prepared the history of his ages and the people of that age, in order to lend him and his ages greater aspects of realness. And I found that by adhering to the facts and the spirit of that history in writing the stories, it was easier to visualize, and therefore to present him as real flesh and blood character rather than a ready-made product. In writing about him and his adventures in various kingdoms of his age, I never violated the facts or the spirits of the history here set down, but have followed the lines of that history closely as the writer of an actual historical fiction follows the lines of actual history. I use this history as a guide in all the stories in this series that I have written. The Hyborian Age. Of that age of epoch by the Nemedian chronicles as the pre-cataclysmic age, little is known except the latter part, and that is veiled in the mists of legendary. Known histories begins with the waning of pre-cataclysmic civilizations, dominated by the kingdoms of Camellia, Velusia, Verulia, Grondar, Thule, and Comoria. These people spoke a similar language, arguing a common origin. There were other kingdoms, equally civilized, but inhabited by different and apparently older races. The barbarians of that age were the Picts, who lived on islands far out in the Western Ocean. The Atlanteans, who dwelt on a small continent between the Pictish Islands and the main, or Thurian continent, and the Lemurians, who inhabited a chain of large islands in the Eastern Hemisphere. There were vast regions of unexplored land. The civilized kingdoms, thought enormous in extent, occupied a comparatively small portion of the whole planet. Velusia was the westernmost kingdom of the Thurian continent, Grondar the easternmost. East of Grondar, people were less highly cultured than those of their kindred kingdoms, stretched a wild and barren expanse of deserts. Among the less arid stretches of desert, in the jungles or among the mountains, lived scattered clans and tribes of primitive savages. Far to the south, there was a mysterious civilization, unconnected with the Thurian culture, and apparently pre-human in its nature. On the far eastern shores of the continent, there lived another race, human but mysterious and non-Thurian, which the Lemurians from time to time came in contact. They apparently came from a shadowy and nameless continent lying somewhere east of the Lemurian Islands. The Thurian civilization was crumbling. Their armies composed largely of barbarian mercenaries. Picts, Atlanteans, and Lemurians were their generals, their statesmen, and often their kings. Of the bickerings of their kingdoms and the wars between Velusia and Comoria, as well as the kingdoms and the conquests by which the Atlanteans founded a kingdom on the mainland, there were more legends than accurate history. Then the cataclysm rocked the world. Atlantis and Lemuria sank, and the Pictish Islands were heaved up to form the mountain peaks of a new continent. Sections of the Thurian continent vanished under the waves or sinking, formed great inland lakes and seas. Volcanoes broke forth, and terrific earthquakes shook down the shining cities of the empires. Whole nations blotted out. The barbarians fared little better than the civilized races. The inhabitants of the Pictish Islands were destroyed, but a greater colony of them settled amongst the mountains of Velusia's southern frontier to serve as a buffer against foreign invasion, untouched. The continent kingdom of the Atlanteans likewise escaped the common ruin, and it came thousands of their tribesmen in ships from the sinking lands. Many Lemurians escaped to the eastern coast of the Thurian continent, which was comparatively untouched. There, they were enslaved by the ancient race which already dwelt there, and their history for thousands of years is a history of brutal servitude. In the western part of the continent, changing conditions created strange forms of plant life and animals. Thick jungles covered the plains, great rivers cut the roads to the sea, wild mountains were heaved up, lakes covered the old ruins of cities and fertile valleys. To the continental kingdom of the Atlanteans from sunken areas swarmed myriads of beasts and savages, ape men and apes, forced to battle continually for their lives, yet they managed to retain vestiges of their former state of highly advanced barbarism. Robbed of metals and ores, they became workers in stone like their distant ancestors and had attained a real artistic level when their struggling culture came into contact with the powerful Pictish nation. The Picts had reverted to flint, but had advanced more rapidly in the matter of population and war science. They had none of the Atlanteans' artistic nature. They were a ruder, more practical, and more prolific race. They left no pictures painted or carved on ivory as did their enemies, but they left remarkably efficient flint weapons in plenty. These stone kingdoms clashed, and in a series of bloody wars, the outnumbered Atlanteans were hurled back into a state of savagery. The evolution of the Picts halted. 500 years after the cataclysm, the barbaric kingdoms have vanished. It is now a nation of savages. The Picts, carrying on continual warfare with tribes of savages, the Atlanteans. The Picts had the advantage of numbers and unity, where the Atlanteans had fallen into loosely knit clans. That was the west of this day. In the distant east, cut from the rest of the world by heaving up gigantic mountains and forming a chain of vast lakes, the Lemurians are toiling as slaves under their ancient masters. The far south is still veiled in mystery. Untouched by the cataclysm, its destiny is still pre-human. Of the civilized races of the Thurian continent, a remnant of one of the non-Volusian nations dwells among the low mountains in the southeast. There's Remy. Here and there about the world are scattered clans of apish savages, entirely ignorant of the rise and fall of these great civilizations. But in the far north, another people are slowly coming into existence. At the time of the cataclysm, a band of savages, whose development was not much above that of the Neanderthals, fled to the north to escape destruction. They found the snowy countries inhabited only by a ferocious snow apes, huge shaggy white animals apparently native to that climate. They fought and drove beyond the Arctic Circle to perish as the savages thought. The latter then adapted themselves to their hardy new environments and throve. After the Pictish-Atlantean Wars had destroyed the beginnings of what might have been a new culture, another lesser cataclysm further altered the appearance of the continent, left a greater inland sea where the chain of lakes had been to further separate the west and east, and the attendant of earthquakes, floods, and volcanoes completed the ruin of the barbarians which their tribal wars had begun. 1,000 years after the lesser cataclysm, the Western world is seen to be a wild country of jungles, lakes, and torrential rivers. Among the forest-covered hills of the Northwest exists wandering bands of ape men without human speech, or the knowledge of fire, or the use of implements. They are the descendants of the Atlanteans, sunk back into squalling chaos of jungle bestiality from which their ages ago ancestors so laboriously crawled. To the southwest dwell scattered clans of degraded, cave-dwelling savages whose speech is of the most primitive form, yet still retain the name of Picts, which has come to mean merely a term designated men themselves to distinguish themselves from true beasts which they contend for life and food. It is their only link with their former stage. Neither the squalid Picts nor the apish Atlanteans have any contact with other tribes or peoples. Far to the east, Lemurians, leveled almost to the bestial plane themselves by the brutish of their slavery, have risen and destroyed their masters. They are savages stalking among the ruins of a strange civilization. The survivors of that civilization, who've escaped the fury of their slaves, have come westward. They fall upon that mysterious pre-human kingdom of the south and overthrow it, substituting their own culture modified by contract with an older one. The new kingdom is called Stygia, and remnants of the older nation seem to have survived, even been worshipped after the race had been destroyed. Here and there in the world, small groups of savages are showing signs of upward trend. These are scattered and unclassified, but in the north, the tribes are growing. These people are called Hyborians, or Hybori. They're god Bori, some great chief, whom legend made even more ancient as the king whom led them to the north in the days of the Great Cataclysm, which the tribes remember only in distorted folklore. They have spread all over the north and are pushing southward in leisurely treks. So far, they have not come into contact with any of the other races. Their wars have been with one another. 1,500 years in the north country have made them tall, tawny-haired, gray-eyed race, vigorous and warlike, already exhibiting well-defined artistry and poetism of nature. They still live mostly by the hunt, but the southern tribes have been raising cattle for some centuries. There's one exception in their so far complete isolation of the other races. A wanderer into the far north returned with the news that a supposedly deserted ice waste inhabited by the most extensive tribe of ape-like men descended. He swore from the beasts driven out of a more large habitable land by the ancestors of the Hyborians. He urged that a large war party be sent beyond the Arctic Circle to exterminate these beasts who he swore were evolving into true men. He was jeered at. A small band of adventurous young warriors followed him north, but none of them returned. The tribes of the Hyborians were drifting south, and as the populations increased, this movement became extensive. The following age was an epoch of wandering and conquest. Across the history of the world, tribes and drifts of tribes move and shift in the ever-changing panorama. Look at the world 500 years later. Tribes of tawny-haired Hyborians have moved southward and westward, conquering and destroying many of the small unclassified clans. Absorbing the blood of conquered races, already the descendants of older drifts have begun to show modified racial traits, and these mixed races attacked fiercely by purer-blooded drifts, and swept before them as broom sweeps debris impartially to become even more mixed and mingled in the tangled debris of races and tag-end of races. As yet the conquerors have not come into contact with the older races. To the southeast, the descendants of the Zemri, given impetus by the new blood resulting from admixture with some unclassified tribes, are beginning to seek to revive some faint shadow of their ancient culture. To the west, the apish Atlanteans are beginning the long climb upward. They have completed the cycle of existence. They have long forgotten their former existence as men, unaware of any other former state. They are starting to climb, upheld and unhindered by human memories. To the south, the Picts remain savages, apparently defying the laws of nature by neither progressing nor retrogressing. Far to the south dreams the mysterious kingdoms of Stygia. On its eastern borders, the clans of nomadic savages, already known as the Sons of Shem. Next to the Picts, in the broad valley of Zing, protected by great mountains, a nameless band of primitives, tentatively classified akin to the Shemites, has evolved an advanced agricultural system and existence. Another factor added to the impetus of Hyborian drift. A tribe of the race discovered in the use of stone building, and the first Hyborian kingdom has come into being. The rude and barbaric kingdom of Hyperborea, which had, in its beginning, a crude fortress of boulders heaped to repel a tribal attack. The people of this tribe soon abandoned their horsehide tents for stone houses, crudely but mightily built, thus protected and grew strong. There were a few more dramatic events in the history than the rise of a rude, fierce kingdom of Hyperborea, whose people turned abruptly from their nomadic life to rear dwellings of naked stone, surrounded by cyclopean walls. A race scarcely emerged from the polished Stone Age, who had, by a freak of nature chance, learned the first rude principles of architecture. The rise of this kingdom drove forth many other tribes, for defeated in war, or refusing to become tributary to their castle-dwelling kinsmen. Many clans set forth on the treks that took them halfway around the world. Already, the more northern tribes are beginning to be harried by gigantic blonde savages, not much more advanced than the ape men. The tale of the next 1,000 years is the tale of the rise of the Hyborians, whose warlike tribes dominate the Western world. Rude kingdoms are taking shape. Tawny-haired invaders have encountered the Picts, driving them into the barren lands of the West. To the northwest, the descendants of the Atlanteans, now unaided by the apedom of their primitive savagery, have not yet met the conquerors. Far to the east, the Lemurians are evolving a strange semi-civilization of their own. To the south, the Hyborians have founded a kingdom of Koth, on the borders of whose pastoral countries known as the land of Shem, and the savages of those lands, partly through contact with the Hyborians, with the contact of the Stygians who had been ravaged by them for centuries, are emerging from barbarism. The blonde savages of the far north have grown in power and the numbers so that northern Hyborian tribes move southward, driving their kindred clans before them. The ancient kingdom of Hyperborea is overthrown by one of the northern tribes, which, however, retains its old name. Southeast of Hyperborea, a new kingdom of Zemri is come into being under the name of Zamora. The southwest, a tribe of Picts have invaded the fertile valley of Zing, conquered the agricultural people there, and settled among them. This mixed race was in turn conquered by a roving tribe of Hybori, and from the mixed elements came the kingdom of Zingara. 500 years later, the kingdoms of the world are clearly defined. The kingdoms of the Hyborians, Aquilonia, Nemedia, Brythunia, Hyperborea, Koth, Ophir, Argos, and Corinthia, and one of the known as the border kingdoms, dominate the western world. Zamora lies to the east, Zingara to the southwest of these kingdoms, but the people alike in darkness of complexion and exotic habits, otherwise unrelated. To the south sleeps Stygia, untouched by foreign invasion, but the peoples of Shem have exchanged the Stygian yoke with less galling ones of Koth. The dusky masters had been driven south of the great river Styx, Nilus, or Nile, which, flowing north from the shadowy hinterlands, turns almost right angles and flows almost due west through the pastoral meadowlands of Shem to the Great Sea. North of Aquilonia, the westernmost Hyborian kingdom, are the Cimmerians, ferocious savages untamed by the invaders but advancing rapidly because of the contact with them. They are the descendants of the Atlanteans, now progressing more steadily than their old enemies, the Picts, who dwell in the wildness west of Aquilonia. Another 5 centuries, and the Hybori people are the possessors of a civilization so virile that contact with it virtually snatched out of the wallow of savagery such tribes it touched. The most powerful kingdom is Aquilonia, but others vie with it in its strength, and mixed races nearest to the ancient rootstock are the Gundermen of Gunderland, a northern province of Aquilonia. But this mixing has not weakened the race. They are supreme in the Western world, though the barbarians of the wastelands are growing in strength. In the north, golden-haired, blue-eyed barbarians, descendants of the Arctic savages, have driven the remaining Hyborian tribes out of the snowy countries, except for the ancient kingdom of Hyperborea, which resists the onslaught. Their country, now called Nordheim. They are divided into the red-haired Vanir of Vanaheim and the yellow-haired Azir of Asgard. Now the Lemurians enter history as the Hyrcanians. Through centuries, they've pushed steadily westward, and now a tribe skirts the south end of the great inland sea, Vilayet, and establishes the southern kingdom of Turan on the southern west shore. Between the inland sea and the eastern borders of the native kingdoms lie vast expanses of steppes, and in the extreme north and extreme south, deserts. The non-Hyrcanian dwellers of the territories are scattered and pastoral unclassified in the north. Shemitish in the south, aboriginal, with a strain of Hyborian blood from wandering conquerors. Toward the latter part of the period, of other Hyrcanian clans push westward around the northern extremity of the inland sea and clash with eastern outposts of the Hyperboreans. Grants gleefully at the people of that ages. The dominant Hyborians are no longer uniformly tawny-haired and gray-eyed. they've mixed with other races. There is strong Shemitish, even a Stygian stain among the peoples of Koth, and to an lesser extent of Argos. While in some case, admixture with the Zingarans have been more extensive than with the Shemites. The Eastern Bryathians have intermarried with the dark-skinned Zamorians, and the people of southern Aquilonia have mixed with the brown Zingarans until black-haired brown eyes are dominant among the people in Poitain, a southernmost province. The ancient kingdom of Hyperborea is more aloof than others, yet its alien blood is in plenty, as they capture foreign women. Hyrcanians, Aesir, Zamorians. Only in the province of Gunderland, where people keep no slaves, is the pure Hyborian stock found unblemished. But the barbarians have kept their bloodstream pure. The Cimmerians are tall, powerful, with dark hair, blue eyes. The Nordheimers are of similar build, but with white skin, blue eyes, and gold or red hair. The Picts are of the same type they always were, short, very dark, with black hair and eyes. The Hyrcanians are a dark, generally tall and slender, though squat, slant-eyed type is more and more common among them, resulting from mixture with a curious race of intelligent though stunted aborigines, conquered by them among the mountains of the eastern Vilayet, or on their westward drift. The Shemites are generally of medium height, though sometimes, when mixed with Stygian blood, gigantic, broadly, strongly built with hooked noses, dark eyes, and black-blue hair. Stygians are tall, well-made, dusky, straight-featured. At least the ruling class of that type. The lower classes are downtrodden. A mongrel horde, a mixture of Stygian, Shemitish, or even Hyborian bloods. South of Stygia are vast black kingdoms of the Amazons, the Kushites, the Atlians, and the hybrid between the Zimbabwe. Between Aquilonia and the Pictish wilderness lie the Bosanian Marches, a people descended by the aboriginal race conquered from a tribe of Hyborians early in the ages of the first Hyborian drift. This mixed people never attained civilizations of the purer Hyborians and was pushed by the fringe of the civilized world. The Bosonians are of medium height and complexion. Their eyes brown or gray. They are mesophilic. They live by agriculture, large walled villages, and they are part of the kingdom of Aquilonia. Their marches extend from the border kingdoms in the north to Zingara in the southwest, forming a bulwark of Aquilonia against the Cimmerians and the Picts. They are stubborn defensive fighters, and centuries of warfare against northern and western barbarians have caused them to evolve a type of defense almost impregnable against direct attacks. 500 years later, the Hyborian civilization was swept away. Its fall was unique in that it was not brought about by internal decay, but by the growing power of barbarian nations in the Hyrcanians. The Hyborian peoples were overthrown and their vigorous culture was yet in its prime. Yet it was Aquilonia's greed which brought that overthrow indirectly. Wishing to extend their empire, the kings made war with their neighbors. Zingara, Argos, and Ophir were annexed outright. With the western cities of Shem, which had their eastern kindred, recently thrown yoke of Koth. Koth itself, with Corinthia and the eastern Shemitish tribes, was forced to pay Aquilonia tribute and lend aid in wars. An ancient feud existed between Aquilonia and Hyperborea, and the latter now marched to meet armies with their western rival. The plains of the bordering kingdoms were the scene of a great and savage battle, which the northern hosts were utterly defeated and retreated into their snowy mountain fortresses. Whether the victorious Aquilonians did not pursue them. Numidia, which had successfully resisted the western kingdom for centuries, now drew Brythunia and Zamora, and secretly Koth into an alliance which bade fair to crush the rising empire. But before the armies could join battle, a new enemy appeared in the east. The Hyrcanians made their first real thrust at the western world. Reinforced by adventurers east of Vilayet, riders of the Turin swept over Zamora, devastated eastern Carinthia were met on the plains of Brythunia by the Aquilonians, who defeated them and hurled them flying eastward. But the back of the alliance was broken, and Numidia took defensive in future wars, aided occasionally by Brythunia and Hyperborea, and thus, secretly, as usual, by Koth. The defeated Hyrcanians showed the nations the real power of the Western kingdoms, whose splendid armies were augmented by mercenaries, many of them recruited amongst the alien Zingarans, the barbaric Picts and Shemites. Zamora was reconquered from the Hyrcanians, but the people rediscovered that had merely exchanged an eastern master for a western master. Aquilonian soldiers were quartered there not only to protect the ravaged country, but to keep the people in subjection. The Hyrcanians were not convinced. 3 more invasions burst upon the Zamoran borders and the lands of Shem, and were hurled back by the Aquilonians. Though through the Turanian armies grew stronger and hordes of steel-clad riders rode out east, skirting the southern extremity of the inland sea. It was in the power growing, destined down the kings of Aquilonia from their high places. In the north, there was incessant bickering amongst the Cimmerian borders between the Black-haired and the Nordheimer. The Azir, between the Vanir Wars, assailed Hyperborea and pushed back the frontier, destroying city after city. The Cimmerians also fought the Picts and the Bosanians impartially, and several times raided into Aquilonia itself, but their wars were less invasions than plundering forays. The Picts were growing amazingly in population and power. By a strange twist of fate, it was largely due to the effort of one man, and he an alien, that set upon their feet that led eventual empire, the man Eris, a Numidian priest, a natural-born reformer. When he turned his mind to the Picts is not uncertain, but this is history. He determined to go into the western wilderness and modify a rude way of heathen by introduction into the gentle worship of Mitra. He was not daunted by grisly tales of what happened to traders and explorers before him, and by some whim of fate, he came among some people he sought, alone, unharmed, and was not instantly speared. The Picts had benefited by contact with Hyborian civilization, but had always fiercely resisted that contact. That is to say, they had learned the way crudely in copper and tin, which were found scantily in their country, and for which later metal they raided into the mountains of Zingara or traded hides, whale's teeth, walrus tusks, and few other things savages have to trade. They no longer lived in caves and tree shelters, but built tents of hide and crude huts, copied from those of the Bosonians. They still lived mainly by the chase, since their wilds swarmed with game, and the rivers, the sea, and fish, but all had learned how to plant grain, which they did sketchily, preferring to steal it from their neighbors, the Bosonians and the Zingarans. They dwelt in clans which were generally at feud with each other, and their simple customs were bloodthirsty and utterly inexplainable to civilized men, such as Eris of Numidia. They had no direct contact with the Hyborians, since the Bosonians acted as a buffer between them. But Eris maintained that they were capable of progress, and the events of truth of his assertion, though scarcely in the ways that he meant. Eris was intelligent, was fortunate in being thrown in with a chief, with more intelligence than usual. Gorm by name. Gorm cannot be explained any more than Chinggis Khan, Othman, or Attila, or any other individuals who, born in the naked land of untutored barbarians, yet possess the instincts for conquest and empire building. In a sort of bastard Bosonian, the priest made the chief understand his purpose. Though extremely puzzled, Gorm gave him permission to remain among the tribe unbutchered, a case unique for the history of the race. Having learned the language, Eris set himself to work to eliminate the more unpleasant phases of Pictish life, such as human sacrifice, blood feud, and the burning alive of captives. He harangued Gorm at length, who he found to be an interested, if unresponsive, listener. Imagination reconstructs the scene. The black-haired chief his tiger skins and necklace of human teeth, squatting in the dirt of a wattle hut, listening intently to the eloquence of a priest who probably sat on a carven, skin-covered block of mahogany provided in his honor, clad in silken robes of an Nemedian priest, gesturing with a slender hand, white as he expounded the eternal rights and justices were the truth of Mitra. Doubtless, he pointed with repugnance at the rows of skulls which adorned the walls of the hut and urged Gorm to forgive his enemies instead of putting their bleached remnants to such uses. Eris was the highest product of an innately artistic race, refined by centuries of civilization. Gorm had behind him a heritage of 100,000 years of screaming savagery. The pad of the tiger was in his stealthy step, the grip of the gorilla in his black-nailed hands, the fire that burns the leopard's eye in his. Eris was a practical man. He appealed to the savage's sense of material gain. He pointed out the power and splendor of Hyborian kingdoms as an example of the power of Mitra, whose teachings and works had lifted them up to their high places. And he spoke of cities and fertile plains, marble walls, iron chariots, jeweled towers, horsemen in their glittering armor riding into battle. And Gorm, with the unerring instincts of a barbarian, passed over his words regarding gods and teachings, and fixed the material powers thus vividly described. There, in the mud-floored wattled hut, with the silk-robed priests on the mahogany block, the dark-skinned chief crouching in his tiger hides, was laid the foundations of empire. As had been said, Eris was a practical man. He dwelt among the Picts for some time, and found that much an intelligent man could do to aid humanity, even when humanity was cloaked in tiger skins and wore necklaces of human teeth. Like all the priests of Mitra, he was instructed in many things. He found there were great deposits of iron ore in the Pictish hills. He taught the natives how to mine and smelt and work it into other implements, agricultural implements, he fondly believed. He instituted other reforms, but these things were most important he did. He instilled Gorm a desire to see the civilized lands of the world. He taught the Picts how to work iron, and he established contact between them and the civilized world. At the chief's request, he conducted him and some warriors through Bosonian marches, where honest villagers stared in amazement into the glittering outer world. Eris no doubt thought he was making converts right and left because the Picts listened to him and refrained from smiting him with their copper axes. But the Picts little calculated to seriously regard his teachings, which forbade him give his enemy and abandoned the war path of their ways for honest drudgery. It is said that he lacked artistic sense. His whole nature led to war and slaughter. When a priest talked of the glories of a civilized nation, his dark-skinned listeners were intent, not on the ideals of his religion, but on the loot in which he unconsciously described in the narration of their rich cities and shining lands. When he told how Mitra aided certain kings to overcome their enemies, they paid scant heed to the miracles of Mitra, but hung on every description of battle lines, mounted knights, maneuvers of archers and spearmen. They hearkened with keen dark eyes, inscrutable countenances, and they went their way without comment and heeded with unflattering intentness his instructions as to working of iron and the kindred arts. Before his coming, they had flitched steel weapons and armor from the Bosonians and Zingarians, or hammered their own, crude from copper and bronze. Now a new world opened to them, and the clang of sledges re-echoed throughout the land. And Gorm, by virtue of his new craft, began to assert his dominance over the other clans, partly by war, partly by craft and diplomacy, in which latter art he excelled all other barbarians. Picts now came and went freely into Aquilonia under safe contact, and they returned with more information as to armor forging and sword making. More, they entered Aquilonia's mercenary armies, to the unspeakable disgust of the sturdy Bosonians. Aquilonia's kings toyed with the idea of playing the Picts against the Cimmerians, and possibly destroying both menaces, but they were too busy dealing with their policies of aggression in the south and east to pay much heed for the vague known lands of the west. from which more and more stocky warriors swarmed to take service among the mercenaries. These warriors, their services completed, went back into the wilderness with their good ideas of civilized warfare and contempt for civilization, which arises from the familiarity with it. Drums began to beat in the hills, gathering fires smoked on the heights, and the savage sword makers hammered their steels on 1,000 anvils. By intrigues and forays too, numerous and devious to enumerate, Gorm became chief of chiefs. The nearest approach to a king of Picts it had in 1,000 years. He had waited long. He was past middle age, but now he moved against the frontiers, not in trade, but in war. Eris saw his mistakes, but it was too late. He had not touched a soul of the pagan, in which he'd lurked the hard fierceness of all the ages. His persuasive eloquence had not caused a ripple in Pictish conscience. Gorm wore a coarse-slitted silver mail now instead of a tiger's skin, but underneath he was unchanged, the everlasting barbarian, unmoved by theology or philosophy, his instincts fixed unerringly on rapine and plunder. The Picts burst onto the Bessonian fields with frontiers of fire and sword, not clad in tiger skins brandishing copper axes of yore, but in scale mail, wielding weapons of keen steel. As for Eris, he was brained by a drunken Pict while making a last effort to undo the work he had unwittingly done. Gorm was not without gratitude. He caused the skull of the slayer to be set atop the priest's cairn. And it is the one grim ironies of the universe that the stones which covered Eris's body, which should have been adorned with the last touches of barbarity, above a man whom violence and blood-seeking vengeance was revolting. But the newer weapons and mails were not enough to break the lines. For years, the superior armaments of the courage of the Bessonians held the invaders at bay, aided, when necessary, by imperial Aquilonian troops. During the time the Hyrcanians came and went, Zamoria was added to the empire. Then treachery from an unexpected source that broke the Bessonian lines. Before chronicling this treachery, it might be well to glance briefly at the Aquilonian Empire. Always a rich kingdom, untold wealth had been rolled in by conquests of sumptuous splendor, had taken a place simple and hardy living. But degeneracy had not yet sapped their kings and the people. Though clad in silks and cloths of gold, they were still a vital, virile race. But the arrogance was supplanting their former simplicity. They treated less powerful people with growing contempt, levying more and more tribute of the conquered. Argos, Zingara, Ophir, Zamora, and the Shemite countries were treated as subjugated provinces, which was especially galling to the proud Zingarans, who often revolted despite their savage retaliations. Goth was practically tributary, being under Aquilonia's protection against the Hyrcanians, but Numidia, the Western Empire, had never been able to subdue, although the latter's triumphs were of the defensive sort, generally attained with the aid of the Hyborian armies. During the period of Aquilonia's only defeats were her failure to annex Numidia, the rout of an army sent into Cimmeria, the almost complete destruction of an army by the Azir. Just as the Hyrcanians found themselves unable to withstand the heavy cavalry charges of the Aquilonians, so the latter, invading the snow countries, were overwhelmed by the ferocious hand-to-hand fighting of the Nordics. But Aquilonia's conquests were pushed into the Nilus, where a Stygian army was defeated with great slaughter, and the king of Stygia sent tribute, once at last, to divert invasion of his kingdom. Brythunia was reduced to a series of whirlwind wars and preparations made to subjugate the ancient rivals at last, Numidia. With their glittering hosts greatly increased by mercenaries, the Aquilonians moved against their old-time foe, and it seemed as if Thrust was destined to crush the last of the Numidian independence. But contentions arose among Aquilonians and their Bessanian auxiliaries. As the inevitable result of imperial expansion, the Aquilonians had become haughty and intolerant. They derided the ruder, unsophisticated Bessonians, and a hard feeling grew between them. the Aquilonians despising the Bessonians, and the latter resenting much attitude of their masters, who now boldly called themselves such and treated the Bessonians like conquered subjects, taxing them exorbitantly, conscripting them for wars of territorial expansion, wars the profits of which the Bessonians shared little. Scarcely enough men were left in the marches to guard the frontier. And the Pictish outrages of their homelands, whole Bessonian regiments quit the Numidian campaign and marched to the western frontier, where they defeated this dark-skinned invader in a great battle. This desertion, however, was the direct cause of Aquilonia's defeat by the desperate Numidians and brought down on the Bessonians the cruel wrath of the imperialists, intolerant, short-sighted as imperialists invariably are. Aquilonian regiments were secretly brought into the borders of the southern marches. The Bessonian chiefs were invited to attend a great conclave, and in the guise of an expedition against the Picts, a band of savage Semitish warriors were quartered among the unsuspecting villagers. The unarmed chiefs were massacred. The Shemites turned on their stunned hosts with torch and sword. Armored imperial hosts were hurled ruthlessly on unsuspecting people. From the north to the south, the marches were ravaged, and the Aquilonian armies marched back from the borders, leaving a ruined and devastated land behind them. And then the Pictish invasion burst into full power along the borders. It was no mere raid, but a concerted rush of a whole nation led by chiefs who'd served in Aquilonian armies, and planned and directed by Grom, an old man now, but with the fire of fierce ambitions undimmed. This time, there were no strong-walled villages in their path manned by sturdy archers to hold back the rush of imperial troops to be brought up. The remnants of the Bessonians were swept out of existence. The blood-mad barbarians swarmed into Aquilonia, looting and burning before the legions, warring with the Numidians before they could be marched into the west. Zingara seized the opportunity to throw off the yoke, which example was followed by Carinthia and the Shemites. Whole regiments of mercenaries and vassals mutinied and marched back to their own countries, looting and burning as they went. The Picts surged irresistibly eastward, and the host after host was trampled beneath their feet. Without their Bessonian archers, the Aquilonians found themselves unable to cope with the terrible arrow fire of the barbarians. From all parts of the empire, legions were recalled to resist the onrush, while from the wilderness, horde after horde swarmed forth, an apparently inexhaustible supply. And in the midst of the chaos, Cimmerians swept down from their hills, completing the ruin. The looted cities devastated the country. They retired into the hills with their plunder. The Picts occupied the land they had overrun. The Aquilonian Empire went down in fire and blood. Then again, the Hyrcanians rode from the Blue East. The withdrawal of the imperial legions of Zamora was their incitement. Zamora fell easy prey to their thrusts, and the Hyrcanian king established his capital amongst the largest in the country. This invasion was from the ancient Hyrcanian kingdom of Turan, on the shores inland of the sea, but another more savage Hyrcanian kingdom in the north. Hosts of steel-clad riders galloped into the northern extremity of the inland sea, traversed by icy deserts, entered the steppes, driving the aborigines before them, and launched themselves into the western kingdoms. The newcomers were not allies with the Turanians, but skirmished with them, as with the Hyborians, new drift of eastern warriors who bickered and fought until they were all united under a great chief who came riding from the very shores of the eastern ocean. With no Aquilonian armies to oppose them, they were invincible. They swept over and subjugated Brythunia, devastated the southern Hyperborea and Carinthia. They swept into the Cimmerian hills, driving the black-haired barbarians before them. But among the hills where cavalry was less effectual, Cimmerians turned on them, and only disorderly retreat at the end of the bloody day of fighting saved the Hyrcanian hosts from complete annihilation. While these events had been transpiring, the kingdom of Shem had conquered their ancient master, Koth, and had been defeated by their attempted invasion of Stygia. But scarcely had completed the degradation of Koth when they were overrun by Hyrcanians and found themselves subjugated by the masters of the Hyborians have ever been. Meanwhile, the Picts had made themselves out to be the complete masters of Aquilonia, practically blotting out the inhabitants. They had broken over the borders of Zingara, and thousands of Zingarans, fleeing into the savages of Argos, threw themselves into the mercy of the westward sweeping Hyrcanians who settled them in Zamora as subjects. Behind them they fled. Argos was enveloped in the flame and slaughter of Pictish conquest, and the slayers swept into Ophir, clashed with westward-riding Hyrcanians. The latter, after their conquest of Shem, had overthrown the Stygian army at the Nilus and overrun the country as far as the Black Kingdom of the Amazon. The people, they'd brought back thousands of captives, settling among the Shemites. Possibly they would have completed their conquest of Stygia, adding it to their widening empire, but for the fierce thrusts of the Picts against the western conquests. Numidia, unconquerable by Hyborians, reeled between the riders of the east and the swordsmen of the west, when a tribe of Azir, wandering down from their snowy lands, came into the kingdom and were engaged as mercenaries. They proved able warriors that they were not able to only beat off the Hyrcanians, but also halt the eastward advance of the Picts. The world at time of presence was some picture. A vast Pictish empire, wild, rude, and barbaric, stretches from the coasts of Vanaheim into the southernmost shores of Zingara. Its southern stretches east to include all Aquilonia except for Gunderland. In the northernmost province, which, a separate kingdom in the hills, survived the fall of the empire and still maintains its independence. The Pictish Empire includes Argos, Ophir, the western part of Koth, the westernmost lands of Shem. Opposed to this barbaric empire of the Hyrcanians, of which northern boundaries are ravaged by the Hyperborea and the southern deserts on the lands of Shem, Zamora, Brythunia, the border kingdom, Corinthia, most of Koth, all of the eastern lands of Shem are included in this empire. The borders of Samaria are still intact. Neither Pict nor Hyrcanian has been able to subdue these warlike barbarians. Numidia, dominated by the Azir mercenaries, resists all invasion. In the north, Nordheim, Samaria, and Numidia separate into conquering races, but in the south, Koth has become a battleground where Picts and Hyrcanians are warring incessantly. Some in the eastern kingdoms expel the barbarians entirely. Again, the plan and cities are in the hands of western invaders. In the far south, Stygia, shaken by the Hyrcanian invasion, is being encroached upon by the great Black Kingdoms. And in the far north, Nordic tribes are restless, warring continually with the Cimmerians and sweeping into the Hyperborean frontiers. Grom was slain by Hjalmar, a chief of the Numidian Asir. He was a very old man, nearly 100 years old. In the 75 years which had elapsed since he had first heard the tales of empires from the lips of Eris, a long time in the life of man, but brief in the space of tales of nations, he had wielded an empire from straying savage clans. He had overthrown a civilization. He, who had been born to the mud-walled, wattled roof, in his old age sat on a throne of gold, and gnawed joints of beef presented to him on golden dishes by naked slave women who were the daughters of ancient kings. Conquest and the acquiring of wealth altered not the Pict. Out of the ruins of the crushed civilizations, no new cultures arose phoenix-like. The dark hands which shattered the artistic glories of the conquered never tried to copy them. Though he sat among the glittered ruins of shattered palaces, clad in his hard body of silks of vanquished kings, the Pict remained eternal, barbarous, ferocious, elemental, interested only in the naked primal principles of life, unchanging, unerring in his instincts, which all were war and plunder, in which arts and the culture of progress and humanity had no place. Not so with the Azir who settled in Nymeria. They soon adopted many ways of their civilized allies, modified powerfully, however, by their intensely virile and alien culture. For a short age of Pict and Hyrcanians snarled at each other to overthrow the ruins of the worlds they had conquered. Then began the Glacier Ages and began the Nordic Drift. Before the southward moving ice fields, northern tribes drifted, driving kindred clans before them. The Azir blotted out the ancient kingdoms of Hyperborea, and across its ruins came to grips with the Hyrcanians. Nemedia had already become a Nordic kingdom, ruled by the descendants of Azir mercenaries. Driven before the onrushing tides of Nordic invasions, the Cimmerians were on the march, and neither army nor city stood before them. They surged across and completely destroyed the kingdom of Gunderland and marched into ancient Aquilonia, hewing their irresistible way through Pictish hosts. They defeated Nordic Nemedians, sacked some of their cities, but they did not halt. They continued eastward, overthrowing Hyrcanian armies on the borders of Brythunia. Between the hordes of Azir and Vanir swarmed into the lands, and the Pictish Empire reeled beneath the strokes. Nemedia was overthrown, and half-civilized Nordics fled before their wilder kinsmen, leaving the cities of Nemedia ruined and deserted. These fleeing Nordics, who only adopted the name of the older kingdom, who the term Nemedia henceforth refers, came the ancient lands of Koth, expelled by the Picts and Hyrcanians, and aided people of Shem to throw off Hyrcanian yoke. All over the Western world, the Picts and Hyrcanians were struggling before this younger, fiercer people. A band of Azir drove the eastern riders from Brythunia and settled themselves there, adopting the name for themselves. The Nordics who had conquered Hyperborea assailed their eastern enemies so savagely that their dark-skinned descendants of the Lemurians retreated into the steppes, pushed irresistibly back towards Vilayet. Meanwhile, the Cimmerians wandered southeastward, destroyed the ancient Hyrcanian kingdom of Turan, and settled on the southwestern shores of the inland. The power of eastern conquerors was broken. Before the attacks of the Nordheimer and the Cimmerians, they destroyed all their cities, butchered such captives as not fit to make them long marches, and then, herding thousands of slaves before them, rode back into their mysterious east, skirting the northern edge of the sea, and vanishing from the west history until they rode out east again, thousands of years later, as the Huns, the Mongols, the Tartars, and the Turks. With them in their retreat went thousands of Zamorians and Zingarans, who were settled into the east, formed races, and emerged after as the Romani. Meanwhile, the Vanir tribes and adventurers had passed along the Pictish coast southward, ravaged ancient Zingara, and come into Stygia, which oppressed a cruel aristocratic ruling class. It was staggering under the thrusts of the Black Kingdoms to the south. The red-haired Vanir led slaves in general revolt, overthrew the reigning class, and set themselves up as a caste of conquerors. They subjugated the northernmost Black Kingdoms and built a vast southern empire to which they called Egypt. From these red-haired conquerors, the pharaohs boasted their descent. The West world now dominated by Nordic barbarians. The Picts still held Aquilonia and the better part of Zingara and the western coast of the continent. But east of Vilayet, and from the Arctic Circle and the lands of Shem, the only inhabitants were roving tribes of Nordheimer, expecting the Cimmerians settled into the old Turian kingdoms. There were no cities anywhere except in Stygia. The lands of Shem, the invading tides of Picts, Hyrcanians, Cimmerians, and the Nordics had leveled them into ruins, and the once dominant Hyborians had vanished from the earth, leaving scarcely a trace of their blood in the veins of their conquerors. Only a few names of lands, tribes, and cities remained in the languages of the barbarians to come down through the centuries connected to the distorted legend and fable, until the history of the Hyborian age was lost in a cloud of mystery and fantasy. Thus, the speech of the Romani lingered in terms with Zingara and Zamora. The Azir, who dominated Nemedia, who were called the Nemedians, later figured Irish history, and the Nordics, who settled Brythunia, later known as the Brythunians, Brythons, or became Britons. There was no such thing at the time as a consolidated Nordic empire. As always, the tribes all had their own chief or king, and while they fought savagely amongst themselves, what their destiny might have been will not be known, because another terrific convulsion of the earth, carving out the lands as they know to moderns, hurled into chaos again. Great strips of the western coast sank. Vanaheim and western Asgard, uninhibited and glacier-haunted wastes for 100 years, vanished beneath the waves. The ocean flowed around the mountains of western Cimmeria to form the North Sea. The mountains became the islands now known as England, Scotland, and Ireland, and waves rolled over what had been the Pictish wilderness and the Pisonian marches. In the north, the Baltic Sea was formed, cutting Asgard into the peninsulas known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And far to the south, the Stygian continent was broken away from the rest of the world. On a line of cleavage formed the river Nilus in its westward trend. Over Argos, the western Koth, and the western lands of Shem washed the blue ocean men called the Mediterranean. But where land sank elsewhere, vast expanses of West Stygia rose out of the waves, forming the whole western half of the continent of Africa. Buckling of the land thrust upon the mountains ranges and in the central part of the northern continent. Whole Nordic tribes blotted out, the rest retreated eastward. The territory about the slowly drying inland sea was not affected, and there on the western shores the Nordic tribes began a pastoral existence, living in more or less peace with the Cimmerians, and gradually mixing with them. In the west, the remnants of the Picts, reduced by the cataclysm once more to a status of Stone Age savagery, began with the incredible virility of their race once more to possess land, until at a later age they were overthrown by the westward drift of the Cimmerians and the Nordics. This was long after the breaking up of the continent that meaningless legends told of former empires. This drift comes within reach of modern history and need not be repeated. It resulted from a growing population which thronged the steppes of the West Inland, which, still later, much reduced in size, was known as the Caspian, to the extent that a migration was an economic necessity. The tribes moved southward, northward, westward, into all the lands known as India, Asia Minor, and Western Europe. They came into the countries as Aryans, but there were variations among these primitive Aryans, some of which were still recognized today, others long forgotten. The blonde Ashanians, Gauls, and Britons, for instance, were descendants of the pure-blooded Asir. The Nemedians of Irish legendary were the Nemedian Asir. The Danes were the descendant of the pure-blooded Vanir. The Goths, ancestors and Scandinavian tribes of the Germanics, including the Anglo-Saxons, were descendants of the mixed race whose elements contained Vanir, Asir, and Cimmerian strains. The Gaels, ancestors of the Irish and Highland Scotch, descended from pure-blooded Cimmerian clans. The Simic tribes of Britain were a mix of Nordic Cimmerian, which proceeded of the Nordic British Isles, and thus gave rise to Gaelic priority. The Cimbri who fought Rome were of the same blood, as well as the Gemeri of the Assyrians and the Grecians and Gomer of the Hebrews. Other clans of the Cimmerians adventured west into the drying inland sea, and few centuries later, with Hyrcanian blood, returned westward as Scythians. The original ancestors of the Gaels gave their name to modern Crimea. The ancient Cimmerians had no connection with the Western races. They were a mixed people, Hyrcanian, Shemitish blood, who had not taken conquerors in retreat. Many tribes of Shem escaped that, and pure-blooded Shemites mixed with Hyborian, Nordic, and are descended of the Arabs, the Israelites, and the Semites. The Canaanites, or Alpine Semites, traced their descendants from Shemitish ancestors mixed with Cushites, settled amongst their Hyrcanian masters. The Elamites were typical of this. The Etruscans, based the Roman, were the descendants of the people mixed in Stygia, Hyrcanian, and Pictish, and originally in the ancient kingdoms of Koth. The Hyrcanians, retreating to the eastern shores of the continent, evolved into the Tartars, the Huns, the Mongols, and the Turks. The origins of other races of the modern world may be similarly traced. In almost every case, older far than they realize, their history stretches back into the forgotten mists of the Hyborian Age. Samaria. I remember. The dark woods, masking slopes of somber hills, the gray clouds led an everlasting arc, the dusky streams that flowed without sound, and lone winds that whispered down the passes. Vista on vista, marching, hills on hills, slope beyond slope, each dark with sullen trees. Our gaunt land lay, so when a man climbed up a rugged peak and gazed, his shaded eye saw the endless vista, hill on hill, slope beyond slope, each hooded like its brother. It was a gloomy land that seemed to hold all winds and clouds and dreams that shunned the sun, with bare boughs rattling in lonesome winds, and the dark woodlands brooding all over, not even lighted by the rare dim sun, which made squat shadows of men. They called it Samaria, land of darkness and deep night. It was long ago and far away. I have forgot the very name men called me. The axe and flint-tipped spears are like a dream, and the hunts and wars are shadows. I recall only the stillness of this somber land, the clouds that pilled forever on the hills, the dimness of the everlasting woods, Samaria, land of darkness and the night. O soul of mine, born of shadowed hills, to clouds and winds and ghosts that shun the sun, how many deaths shall serve to break at last the heritage which wraps me in grey apparel of ghosts? I search in my heart and find Samaria, the land of darkness and the night. We're going to take a brief 2-minute intermission, and then we will begin the Phoenix on the Sword. The Phoenix on the Sword by R.E. Howard. Over shadowy spires and gleaming towers lay the ghostly darkness and silence that runs before dawn. Into a dim alley, once a veritable labyrinth of mysterious winding ways, four masked figures came hurriedly from a door, which a dusky hand furtively opened. They spoke not, but went silently into the gloom, cloaks wrapped closely about. As silently as ghosts of murdered men, they disappeared in the darkness. Behind them, a sardonic countenance was framed partly in the door. A pair of evil eyes glittered malevolently in the gloom.
"Go into the night, creatures of the night,"
a voice mocked.
"O fools! Your doomhounds, your heels like a blind dog, and you know it not."
The speaker closed the door and bolted it, then turned and went up the corridor, candle in hand. He was a somber giant whose dusky skin revealed Stygian blood. He came to the inner chamber. A tall, lean man wore a velvet lounged like a gray, lazy cat on a silken couch, sipping wine from a huge goblet. "Well, Ascalante," said the Stygian, setting the candle down, "your dupes have slunk into the street like street rats from their burrows. You work with strange tools."
"Tools," replied Ascalante. "Why, they consider me for that. For months now, ever since rebel force summoned me from the southern desert, I've been living in the very heart of my enemies, hiding from days in the obscure house, skulking through dark alleys and dark corners could not, working through them and through other agents, many whom have never seen my face. I've honeycombed the empire with seduction and unrest. In short, I, working in shadows, have paved the downfall of the king who sits on the son of the throne. By Mitra and statesmen before, I was an outlaw."
"And these dupes who deem themselves your masters?"
"They will continue to think that I serve them until our present task is completed. Who are they to match the wits of Ascalante? Vilmana, the dwarfish Count of Caraban? Grommel, the giant commander of the Black Legion? Dion, the fat baron of Adalis? Rinaldo, the harebrained minstrel? I am the force which is welded together, steel in each, and by each clay I will crush them when time comes. But that lies in the future. Tonight the king dies."
"Days ago, I saw Imperial squadrons rise from the city," said the Stygian again.
"They rode to the frontier, which the heathen Picts assail, thanks to the strong liquor which I've smuggled over the borders to madden them. Dion's great wealth has made that possible, and Vilmana made it possible to dispose of the rest of the Imperial troops which remained in the city. Though princely kin in Numidia, it was easy to persuade King Numa to request the Count Trucker of Pontaine, Seneschal of Aquilonia, and of course to him honor, ill-acquainted by imperial escort, as well own troops Prospero, King Conan's right-hand man. That leaves only the king's personal bodyguard in the city, besides the Black Legion. Through Grommel, I've corrupted a spendthrift officer of that guard and bribed him to lead the men away from the king's door at midnight. Then, with 16 desperate rogues of mine, we enter the palace through a secret tunnel. After the deed is done, even if the people do not rise to welcome us, Grommel's Black Legion will be sufficient to hold the city and the crown."
"And Dion thinks the crown will be given to him?"
"Yes, the fat fool claims it by reason of trace of royal blood. Conan makes bad mistake letting men live who still trace and boast descent of the old dynasty from which he tore the crown of Aquilonia. Vilmana wishes to be reinstated in royal favor as he was under the old regime, so that he may lift poverty-ridden estates from the former grandeur. Grommel hates Palantides. commander of black dragons, and desires the command of the whole army with all stubbornness of Basunian. All of us, Ronaldo, has no personal ambition. He sees Conan a red-handed, rough-footed barbarian who comes out of the north to plunder a civilized land. He idealizes a king Conan killed to the crown, remembering only that is occasionally patronizing the arts, forgetting the evils of his reign, and that he, making the people forget. Already they openly sing and lament for the king, in which Ronaldo lauds the lauded villain and denounces Conan, that black-hearted savage from the abyss. Conan laughs, but the people snarl.
And why does he hate Conan?
Poets always hate those in power. To them, perfection is always just behind the last corner, or beyond the next. They escape the present dreams and of the past futures. Ronaldo is a flaming torch of idealism. Rising, he thinks, to overthrow a tyrant and liberate people. As for me, well, a few months ago, I had lost all ambition but to raid the caravans for the rest of my life. Now, old dreams stir. Conan will die. Dion will mount the throne. Then he will die. One by one, all who oppose me. By fire, steel, or by deadly wines you know so well to brew. Ascalante will be king of Aquilonia. How you like the sounds of it?
The Stygian just shrugged his shoulder.
There was a time,
He said with unconcealed bitterness,
when I too had my ambitions,
beside which yours seemed tawdry and childish. To what a state I had fallen. My old-time peers and rivals would stare indeed the Thothamon, and the ring serving the slaves of an outlier aiding petty ambitions and kings. You laid your trust in magic and murmury, and I lay mine in wits and sword. Wits and sword are drawn against darkness and wisdom of the kingdom, growled the Stygian. Had I not lost the ring, our positions might be reversed.
Nevertheless,
answered the outlaw impatiently,
you wear the stripes of my whip on your back and are likely to continue to wear them.
Be not so sure. The fiendish hatred of the Stygian glittered for an instant redly in his eyes. Somehow I doubt I will find the ring again, and when I do, by the serpent's fangs of Set, you shall pay. The hot-tempered Aquilonian started up and struck him with heavily across the mouth. Thoth reeled back, starting from his lips.
You grow overbold, dog, growled the outlaw. Have a care. I am still your master, who knows your dark secret. Go upon your housetops and shout that Ascalante is plotting against your king if you dare.
I dare not, muttered the Stygian, wiping the blood from his lips.
No, you do not dare,
Ascalante grinned.
For if I die by your stealth or treachery, a hermit priest in the southern desert will know of it and break the seal of manuscript I left in his head, and having read, a word will be whispered upon Stygia, and a wind will creep from the south by midnight. And where will you hide your head, Thothamon?
The slave shuddered. His dusky face went ashen.
Enough!
Ascalante changed his tone peremptorily. I have work for you. I do not trust Dion. I bade him ride to his country estate and remain there until the work is done tonight. The fat fool could never conceal his nervousness before the king today. Ride after him, and if you do not overtake him on the road, proceed to his estate and remain with him until we send for him. Don't let him out of your sight. He is mazed with fear and might bolt, even rush to Conan in a panic and reveal the whole plot trying to save his own hide. Go! The slave bowed, hiding the hate in his eyes, as did his bidden. Ascalante turned to his wine. Over the jeweled spires, a crimson as dawn in blood. The room was large and ornate, with rich tapestries on the polished, pandered walls, deep rugs on ivory floors, with a lofty ceiling adorned with intricate carvings and silver scroll work. Behind an ivory, gold inlaid writing table, a man with broad shoulders and a sun-browned skin who seemed out of place among those luxuriant surroundings. He seemed more a part of the sun and winds and high places of the outlands. His slightest movement spoke of steel spring muscles knit to a keen brain with the coordination of a born fighting man. There was nothing deliberate or measured about his actions. Either he was perfectly at rest, still, as the bronze statue, or he was as in motion, not with the jerky quickness of over-tense nerves, but with cat-like speed that blurred sight which tried to follow him. His garments were rich fabric, but simply made. He wore no rings or ornaments, and his square-cut black mane was confined merely to a cloth silver band above his head. Now, he laid down the golden stylus, which he'd been laboring scrawling on waxed papyrus, rested his chin on his fist, and fixed his smoldering blue eyes enviously on the man who stood before him. This person was preoccupied with his own affairs, and in the moment he was taking up laces of the gold-chased armor, abstractly whistling, rather unconventional performance considering that he was in the presence of the king. "Prospero," said the man at the table. "All these matters of statecraft weary me, as all the fighting I have done never did." "You're part of the game, Conan," answered the dark-haired Pointanan. "You are king. You must play the part." "I wish I might ride with you to Nemedia," said Conan enviously. "It seems ages since I have ridden a horse between my knees, but Publius says that affairs in the city require my presence. Curse him! When I overthrew the old dynasty," he continued speaking with the easy familiarity that existed only between the Pointanan and himself, "it was easy enough, though it seemed bitter hard at the time. Looking back now over the wild path I followed, the days of toil, intrigue, slaughter, and tribulation, they seem like a dream. I did not dream far enough, Prospero. When King Nemedes lay dead at my feet, and I tore the crown from his gory head and set it upon my own, I reached the ultimate border of my dream. I had prepared myself to take the crown, not to hold it. In the old free days, all I wanted was a sharp sword and a straight path to my enemies. Now, no paths are straight, and my sword is useless. When I overthrew the Nemedes, I was a liberator. Now they spit at my shadow. They've put a statue of the swine over in the temple of Mitra, and people go and wail before it, hailing as the holy effigy of a saintly monarch who was done death by the red-handed barbarian. When I led her armies to victory as a mercenary, Aquilonia looked at the fact I was a foreigner, but now she cannot forgive me. Now, in Mitra's temple, there comes to burn the incenses of Nemedes. Memory, men who his hangmen maimed and blinded, men whose sons died in his dungeons, whose wives and daughters were dragged in his seraglio. These fickle fools! Ronaldo is largely responsible, answered Prospero, drawing his sword belt up another notch. He sings songs that make men mad. Hang him in his jester's garb to the highest tower in the city. Let him rhymes for the vultures. Conan shook his lion head. No, Prospero, he's beyond my reach. The great poet is greater than any king. His songs are mightier than my scepter. For he has near ripped the heart from my breast when he chose to sing for me. I shall die and be forgotten, but Rinaldo's songs will live forever. No, Prospero, the king continued, a somber look of doubt shadow in his eyes. There is something hidden, some undercurrent of which I am not aware. I sense it as in my youth as I sensed a tiger hiding in the tall grass. There is a nameless unrest in this kingdom. I am a hunter who crouches by his small fire amid the forest and hears stealthily feet padding in the darkness and almost sees the glimmer of burning eyes. If I could come but to grips with something tangible, I could cleave my sword. I tell you, it is not by chance the Picts have so fiercely assailed the frontiers, so that the Bosonians have called for aid to beat them back. I should have ridden with my troops. Publius feared a plot to trap and slay you beyond the frontier, replied Prospero, smoothing his silken coat, shining over his mail, admiring the tall, lithe figure in the silver mirror. That's why he urged you to remain in the city. These doubts are born of your barbarian instincts. Let the people snarl. The mercenaries are ours, and the black dragons, and every rogue in the Pontaine swears to you. Your only danger is assassination, and that's impossible, with the men of the Imperial troops guarding you day and night. What are they working there? A map, Conan answered with pride. The map of the court shows well the countries of the south, east, and west, but in the north they are vague and faulty. I am adding the northern lands myself. Here is Samaria, where I was born, and Asgard, and Vanaheim. Prospero scanned the map. By Mitra, I had almost believed those countries to be fabulous. Conan grinned savagely, involuntarily touching the scar on his dark face. You'd have known otherwise had you spent your youth on the northern frontiers of Samaria. Asgard lies to the north, Vanaheim to the northwest of Samaria, and there's continual war amongst the border. What manner of men are these northern folk like? Asked Prospero. Tall, fair, blue-eyed. Their god is Ymir, the frost giant. Each tribe has its own king. They are wayward and fierce. They fight all day, they drink ale, and roar their wild songs through the night. Then I think you are like them, laughed Prospero. You laugh greatly and drink and bellow good songs, though I never saw another Cimmerian who drank aught but water, or whoever laughed sang the songs chant dismal dirges. Perhaps it's the land they lived in, answered the king. A gloomier land never was, of all hills, darkly wooded, under skies nearly always gray, with little winds moaning drearily down the valleys. Little wonder the men grew moody there, quoth Prospero with a shrug of his shoulders, thinking of the smiling, sun-washed plains and blue lazy rivers of Pontaine, Aquilonia's southernmost province. They have no hope here, or hereafter, answered Conan. Their gods are Crom, and his dark race, who ruled over a sunless place of everlasting mist in a world of the dead. Mitra! The ways of Azir were more to my liking. Well, grinned Prospero, the dark hills of Samaria are far behind you, and I go now. I'll quaff a goblet of white Nemedian for you at Numa's court. Good, grunted the king. But kiss Numa's dancing girls for yourself only, lest it involves the state. His gusty laughter followed Prospero out of the chamber. Under the coils caverned by pyramids great set coils asleep. Among the shadows of his tombs, his dusky people creep. I speak the word from the hidden gulfs that never knew the sun. Send me a servant for my hate, O scaled, O shining one. The sun was setting, etching the green and hazy blues in the forest brief gold. The waning beams glinted thick golden chain of which Dion of Attalus twisted continually, his pudgy hand in which he set the riot of blossoms, flowers growing in witch's garden. He shifted his fat body on his marble seat, glanced furtively, as in his quest of a lurking enemy. He sat in a circular grove of slender trees, whose interlapping branches cast a thick shade over him. Near the hand at a fountain tinkled silvery, and other unseen fountains in various parts of the great garden whispered an everlasting symphony. Dion was alone, except a great dusky figure which lounged on a marble bench close at hand. Watching the Baron with a deep, somber eye, Dion gave little thought to Thothamon. He vaguely knew who he was, a slave. In Ascalante reposed much trust, but like many rich men, Dion paid scant heed to men below his own station in life. You don't need be nervous, said Thoth. The plan cannot fail. Ascalante can make mistakes as well another, snapped Dion, sweating at the mere thought of Hill. Not he, grinned the Stygian savagely. Else I had not been his slave, but his master. What talk is this? Peevishly Dion, with only half a mind to the conversation. Thothamon's eyes narrowed. For all his iron self-control, he was near bursting with long pent-up shame, hate, and rage, ready to take any sort of desperate chance. What he did not reckon on was the fact that Dion saw him, not as a human being with brain and wit, but as simply a slave, and such a creature beneath notice. Listen to me, said Thoth. You will be king. But you know little of the mind of Ascalante. You cannot trust him. Once Conan is slain, I can help you. If you protect me when you come to power, I will aid you. Listen, my lord. I was a great sorcerer in the south. Men spoke of Thoth-Anon as they spoke of Raman. King Stephsfon of Stygia gave me the great honor casting down magicians from high places to exalt me above them. They hated me, but they feared me, for I controlled beings from the outside, which call at my name and did bid me. By Set, my enemy knew not the hour which he might awake at midnight to feel the taloned fingers of nameless horror at his throat. I did dark and terrible magic with the serpent ring of Set, which I found in a nighted tomb beneath the earth, forgotten before the first man crawled of the slimy sea. But a thief stole my ring, and my power was broken. The magicians rose up to slay me, and I fled. Disguised as a camel driver, I was traveling in a caravan in the lands of Koth when Ascalante's reavers fell upon us. All in the caravan were slain except myself. I saved my life by revealing my identity to Ascalante and swearing to serve him. Bitter has been my bondage. To hold me fast, he wrote of me in a manuscript and sealed it and gave it to the hands of a hermit who dwells in the southern borders of Koth. I dare not strike a dagger into him while he sleeps or betray his enemies, for the hermit would open the manuscript and read. Thus Ascalante instructed him, and he would speak a word in Stygia. Again, Thoth shuddered, and the ashen hue of his dusky skin. Men knew me not in Aquilonia, he said. But should my enemies in Stygia learn my whereabouts, not the width of a half a world between would suffice to save me from the doom that would blast the soul of a bronze statue. Only a king with castles, a host of swordsmen could protect me. So, I have told you my secret. I have urged you make a pact with me. I may aid you in your wisdom, and you can protect me. And someday I will find the ring. Ring? Ring! Thoth had underestimated the man's utter egoism. Dion had not even been listening to the slayer's words, so completely engrossed with his own thoughts. But the final words stirred a ripple in his self-centeredness. Ring? He repeated. That makes me remember my ring of good fortune. I had it from a Shemitish thief. He said he stole from a wizard far from the south and that it would bring me good luck. I paid him enough, but Mitra knows. By gods, I need to have all the luck I can, what with Volmana and Escalante dragging me into their bloody plots. I'll see to the ring. Thoth sprang up, blood mounting darkly to his face, while his eyes flamed with the stunned fury of a man who suddenly realized the full depths of the fool's swinish stupidity. Dion never heeded him. Lifting a secret lid on the marble seat, he fumbled for among a heap of gewgaws and various kinds, barbaric charms, bits of bone, pieces of tawdry jewelry, luck pieces, and conjures which a man's superstitious natures had prompted him to collect. Ah, here it is! He triumphantly lifted a ring of curious make. It was a metal like copper, and it was made in the form of a scaled serpent, coiled in 3 loops, with its tail in its mouth. Its eyes were yellow gems which glittered balefully. Thothamon cried out as he'd been struck, and Dion wheeled and gaped, his face suddenly bloodless. The slave's eyes were burning, his mouth wide, his dusky hands outstretched the talons. "The ring! By Set, the ring!" he shrieked. "My ring stolen from me!" Steel glittered in the Stygian's hand, and with a heave of his great dusky shoulders, he drove a dagger into the Baron's fat body. Dion squeaked. Broke into a strangled gurgle, and his whole flabby flame collapsed like melted butter. A fool to the end, he died in mad terror, not knowing why. Flinging aside the crumpled corpse, already forgetful of it, Thoth grasped the ring in his hands, his dark eyes blazing with fearful avidness. "My ring," he whispered in terrible exultation. "My power." How long he crouched over the baleful thing, motionless as a statue, drinking the evil aura into his dark soul. Not even the Stygian knew. When he shook himself, his reverie drew back his mind from the nighted abysses where he'd been questing. The moon was rising, casting long shadows across the smooth marble back of the garden seat, at the foot of which sprawled a darker shadow which had been Lord Attalus. "No more. Escalante no more," whispered the Stygian. His eyes burned red as a vampire's in the gloom. Stooping, he cupped his handful of congealing blood from the sluggish pool which his victim sprawled, rubbing the copper serpent's eyes until the yellow sparks were covered by a crimson mask. "Blind your eyes, mystic serpent," he chanted in a blood-freezing whisper. "Blind your eyes, the moonlight, and open them on darker gulfs. What do you see now, O serpent of Set? Whom do you call from the gulfs of night? Who the shadows fall on waning light? Call him to me, O serpent of Set." Stroking the scales with peculiar motion of his fingers, which always carried the ring back to the starting place, his voice sank lower as he whispered dark names, grisly incantations, forgotten the world over, save grim hinterlands of dark Stygia, where monstrous shapes moved among the dusk of the tombs. There was a movement in the air about him, such a swirl as made in water when some creature rises to the surface. A nameless, freezing wind blew on him, as if a door opened. Thoth felt a presence at his back, but he did not look about. He kept his eyes fixed on the moonlit space of the marble, which a tenuous shadow hovered. He continued his whispered incantations. The shadow grew in size and clarity until it stood out a distinct and horrific. Its outline was not like that of a gigantic baboon, but no baboon such large ever walked the earth, not even in Stygia. Still, Thoth did not look, but drawing from the girdle of the sandal of his master, always carried the dim hope he might be able to put it to such use. He cast behind him. "Know it well, slave of the ring," he exclaimed. "Find him who wore it and destroy him. Look into his eyes and blast his soul before you, tear out his throat, kill him, I." In a blind of burst in passion, and all with him. Etched on the moonlight wall, Thoth saw the horror lower its misshapen head, take the scent like some hound. A grisly head was thrown back. The thing wheeled and was gone like wind through the trees. The Stygian flung his arms up, maddened in exultation, and his teeth and eyes gleamed in the moonlight. A soldier on guard on the walls yelled in startled horror as a great, loping shadow with flaming eyes cleared the wall and swept him in a swirling rush. But it was gone so swiftly the bewildered warrior was left wondering, had it been a dream or a hallucination? Alone in the great sleeping chamber, with its high golden dome, King Conan slumbered and dreamed. Though swirling gray mists, he had not heard a curious call, faint, afar, though he did not understand it, and seemed not within his power to ignore it. Sword in hand, he went through the gray mists, as a man might walk through clouds, and the voices grew more distinct as he proceeded until he understood the word it spoke. It was his own name being called across the gulfs of space or time. The mists grew lighter, and he saw that he was in the great dark corridor that seemed to be cut in stolid black stone. It was unlighted, but by some magic he could see plainly. The floor, ceiling, and walls were highly polished, gleaming dully. They were carved with figures of ancient heroes and half-forgotten gods. He shuddered to see the vast, shadowy outlines of the nameless ones, and he knew somehow the mortal feet had not traversed the corridor for centuries. He came upon a wide stair carved in the solid rock, and the sides of the shaft were adorned with esoteric symbols so ancient and horrific that King Conan's skin crawled. The steps were carven with each step the abhorrent figure of the old serpent set, so that each step had planted his heel on the head of the old snake as it was intended from the old times. But he felt no less at ease in all of that. But the voice called on him, and at last in darkness that strange have been impenetrable to his material eyes, he came into the strange crypt and saw a vague, white-bearded figure sitting on a tomb. Conan's hair rose up, and he grasped his sword, but the figure spoke in sepulchral tones. "Oh man, do you know me?" "Not I, by Crom," swore the king. "Man," said the ancient, "I am Epimetheus, but Epimetheus the sage has been dead for 1,500 years, stammered Conan. "Hearken," spoke the other commandingly. "As a pebble cast into the dark lake sends ripples, the further stone, happenings in the unseen world have broken like waves on slumber. I have marked you well, Conan of Samaria. The stamp of mighty happenings, the great deed is upon you. But dooms are loose in the land, against which a sword cannot aid you." "You speak in riddles," said Conan uneasily. "Let me see my foe, and I will cleave his skull to his teeth." "Loose your barbarian fury against foes of flesh and blood," answered the ancient. "It is not men I must shield you. There are dark worlds barely guessed by men where formless monsters stalk, fiends which may draw from the outer voids to take material shape and rend devour beings of evil magicians. There is a serpent in your house, O king, an adder in your kingdom, come from Stygia, with the dark wisdom, shadows murky in his soul, as a man sleeping of dreams of the serpent which crawls near him. I have felt the foul presence of Set's neophyte. He is drunk with terrible power. He blows, he strikes his enemy, and he will bring you a kingdom. I have called you to me to give you a weapon against him and his hellhound pact." "But why?" bewilderedly asked Conan. "May you sleep in the black heart of Golamira, whence you send forth your ghost on unseen wings to aid Aquilonia in the times of need. But I am an outlander and a barbarian." "Peace," Ghostly tones reverberated through shadowy carven. Your destiny is with Aquilonia. Gigantic happenings are forming in the web and the womb of fight, and the blood-mad sorcerer shall not stand in the path of imperial destiny. Ages ago, Set coiled the world like a python about its prey. All my life, which was the lives of 3 common men, I fought him. I drove him into the shadows of the mysterious south. But in the dark Stygia, men still worship him, who to us the archdemon is. As I fought Set, I fight his worshippers, his votaries, and his acolytes. Now hold out your sword. Wondering, Conan did so, and also the great blade, close to the heavy silver guard. An ancient, traced, bony-fingered, a strange symbol that glowed like white fire in the shadows. And, on an instant, the tomb and ancient vanished. Conan, bewildered, sprang from his couch in the great gold-domed chamber. And as he stood bewildered at the strangeness of his dream, he realized he was gripping his sword in his hand, and his hair pricked at the nape of his neck. For the broad blade was a carven symbol, the outline of a phoenix. And he remembered that on the tomb in the crypt where he had seen the familiar figure carven of stone. Now he wondered if it had been of stone at all. And his skin crawled at the strangeness of it. Then, as he stood, stealthy sound in the corridor outside brought him to life. Without stopping to investigate, the barbarian donned his armor, and again, the barbarian suspicious and alert as a gray wolf at bay. Through the silence which shrouded the corridor of the royal palace stole 20 furtive figures. Their stealthy feet, bare or cased in leather, made no sound on the thick carpets and bare marble tile. Their torches, which stood 9 inches along the hall, gleamed red on the dagger, sword, and keen axe.
Easy all,
hissed Ascalante.
Stop that loud breathing, whomever it is. The officer of the night guard has removed most of the sentries from these halls and has made the rest drunk, but be careful. Back. Here comes God.
They crowded behind a cluster of carven pillars, and almost immediately 10 giants in black armor swung at a measured pace. Their faces showed doubt as they glanced at the officer who was leading them away from the post of his duty. The officer was rather pale, and the guard passed the hiding places of the conspirators he had seen to wipe the sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. He was young, and this betrayal of his king did not come to him easily. He mentally cursed the vain, glorious extravagance which had put him in debt to the moneylenders and made him a pawn of the scheming politicians. The guardsmen clanked by and disappeared up the corridor.
Good,
Ascalante grinned.
Conan sleeps unguarded. Haste. If they catch us killing him, we're undone. We're but a few men, and expose the killing of a dead king.
Aye, haste, cried Ronaldo, his blue eyes matching the gleam of his sword swung above his head. My blade is thirsty. I hear the gathering of vultures. On. They hurried down the corridor with the reckless speed of Aquilonia.
Grovel,
snapped Ascalante.
Break me this door open.
The giant drew a deep breath and launched his mighty frame against the panels, which groaned and bent at the impact. Again he crouched and plunged, the snapping of bolts and rending crash of wood as the door splintered and burst inward.
In!
Roared Ascalante, on fire with the spirit of the deed.
In! Death to the tyrant!
Yelled Ronaldo. They stopped short. Conan faced them. Not a naked man aroused, mazed, unarmed, out of a deep sleep to be butchered like a sheep, but the barbarian, wide awake, partly armored, with his longsword in hand. For an instant the tableau held. 4 rebel noblemen in the broken door, and hordes of wild, hairy faces crowding them, all momentarily frozen by the blazing-eyed giant standing sword in hand in the middle of a candlelit chamber. In that instant, Ascalante beheld the small table near the royal couch with the silver scepter, the slender gold circlet which was the crown of Aquilonia. The sight maddened him with desire.
In, rogues! He is one! We are 20, and he has no helmet!
True, there had not been time to don the heavy plumed casque or to lace the side plates of his cuirass, nor was there now time to snatch the great shield from the wall. Still, Conan was better protected than any of his foes, except Volmana and Grommel, who were in full armor. The king glared, puzzled as to their identity. Ascalante he did not know, but he could see through the closed visors of the armored conspirators, and Ronaldo pulled his slouch cap way above his eyes. But there was no time to surmise. With a yell rang to the roof, the killers flooded into the room. Grommel first. He came charging like a bull, head down, sword low for a disemboweling thrust. Conan met him with the tigerish strength that went into the arm that swung the sword. In a whistling arc, the great blade flashed through the air and crashed onto the Bosonian's helmet. Blade and casque shivered, and Grommel rolled lifeless to the floor. Conan bounded back, still gripping the broken hilt.
Grommel!
He spat, his eyes blazing in amazement as the shattered helmet disclosed a shattered head. Then the rest of the pack upon him. A dagger raked along his ribs between the breastplate and backplate. A sword edge flashed before his eyes. He flung the dagger wielder with his left arm and smashed the broken hilt like a kestis into the swordsman's temple. The man's brains spattered into his face.
Watch the door, 5 of you!
Screamed Ascalante, dancing with the edge of singing steel whirlpool, for he feared that Conan might smash through their midst and escape. The rogues drew back momentarily. Their leader seized several and thrust them towards the single door. In a brief respite, Conan leapt toward the wall and tore therefore an ancient battle axe untouched. He had hung there for half a century. With his back to the wall, he faced them, closing ring for a flashing instant, and then leaped into the room in the thick of them. He was no defensive fighter, and even in the teeth of overwhelming odds, he always carried the war to his enemy. Any other man would have already died in there. Conan himself did not hope to survive, but he ferociously wished to inflict as much damage as he could before he fell. His barbaric soul was ablaze, and the chants of old heroes now singing in his ears. He sprang from the wall, his axe dropped an outlaw, with a severed shoulder and a terrible backhand returned, crushed skull of another. Swords whined venomously about him, but death passed him by, breathless margins. The Cimmerian moved in a blinding speed. He was like a tiger among baboons. He leaped, sidestepped, he spun, offered an ever-moving target, while his axe wove a shining wheel of death around him. For a brief space, the assassins crowded him fiercely, raining blows blindly and hampered by their own numbers, then gave back suddenly. 2 corpses on the gave mute the evidence of the king's fury, though Conan, bleeding himself from a wound on his arm, his neck, and his legs.
Knaves!
Screamed Ronaldo. Do you shrink from combat? Shall the despot of your lives? On with it! He rushed in, hacking madly, but Conan recognized him, shattered his sword with the terrific chop, and with a powerful push of his open hand, sent him reeling to the floor. The king took Ascalante's point in his left arm, and the outlaw barely saved his life by ducking and springing backwards from the swinging axe. Again, the wolf swirled in, and Conan's axe sang and crushed. A hairy rascal stooped beneath his stroke and dived at the king's legs, but after wrestling for a brief instant at what could seem to be a solid iron tower, glanced up just in time to see an axe falling, but not in time to avoid it. The interim one of comrades lifted a broadsword with it in both hands and hewed through the king's left shoulder plate, wounding the shoulder beneath. In an instant, Conan's cuirass was full of blood. Volmana, flinging attacks left and right in his savage, Impatience came plowing through and hacked murderously at Conan's unprotected head. The king ducked deeply, the sword shaved a lock of the black hair as it whistled above him. Conan pivoted on his heel and struck him. The axe crunched through the curry as Volmana crumpled to the floor as his whole left side caved in. Volmana, gasped Conan breathlessly. I'll know that dwarf in hell. He straightened to meet the maddened rush of Ronaldo, who charged back into the wide open, armed only with a dagger. Conan leaped back, lifting his axe. Ronaldo! His voice was strident, desperate urgency. Back! I would not slay you! Die, tyrant! Screamed the mad minstrel, hurling himself headlong into the king. Conan delayed the blow, which he was loth to deliver until it was too late. Only when he felt the bite of steel to his unprotected side did he, in a frenzy of blind desperation. Ronaldo dropped with his skull shattered, and Conan reeled against the wall, blood spurting between his fingers, gripping the wounds. And now, slay him! Yelled Ascalante. Conan was put back against the wall, lifted his axe. He stood like an image of the unconquerable, primordial, legs braced apart, head thrust forward, one hand clutching the wall for support, gripping his axe against his thigh, the great corded muscles standing out in iron ridges, features frozen in a death snarl of fury, his eyes blazing terribly through amidst of the blood that veiled them. The men faltered, wild, criminal, dissolute they were, yet they came a breed of men called civilized, with a civilized background. Here was the barbarian, the natural killer. They shrank back. A dying tiger can still deal death. Conan sensed their uncertainty, grinned mirthlessly and ferociously. Who dies first? He mumbled through smashed and bloody lips. Ascalante leapt like a wolf, halted almost in midair with incredible quickness, and fell prostrate to avoid the death which was hissling toward him. He frantically whirled his feet out of the way and rolled clear as Conan recovered from his missed blow and struck again. This time, the axe sank inches into deep polished floor close to Ascalante's legs. Another misguided desperado chose this instant to charge, following half-heartedly by his fellows. He intended on killing Conan before the Cimmerian could wrench his axe from the floor, but his judgment was faulty. The red axe lurched up and crashed down, and a crimson caricature of a man catapulted back against the legs of the attackers. That instant, a fearful scream burst from the rogues at the door as a black misshapen shadow fell across the wall. All but Ascalante wheeled at the cry, and then howling like dogs, they burst blindly through the door. Raving, blaspheming mob scattered through the corridors of screaming light. Ascalante did not look towards the king. He had only the eye for... Looked towards the door. He had only the eye for the wounded king. He supposed the noise of the fray had last roused the palace, and that the loyal guards were upon them, though even in that moment it seemed strange that the hardened rogues should scream in such a terrible flight. Conan did not look towards the door because he was watching an outlaw with burning eyes of a dying wolf. In extremity, Ascalante's cynical philosophy did not desert him. All seems to be lost, particularly honor, he murmured. But when a king is dying on his feet, and whatever cognition might have passed through his mind not be known, for leaving the sentence completely unfinished, he ran lightly at Conan just as the Cimmerian was performance employing the axe to wipe the blood from his blind eyes. But even as he began the charge, there was a strange rushing in the air. Heavy weight struck terrifically between his shoulders. He was dashed headlong. The great talons sank agonizingly into his flesh. Writhing desperately beneath the attacker, he twisted his head and stared upon the nightmare and lunacy. Upon him crouched a great black thing which he knew was born in no sane or human world. Its slavering fangs were near his throat, and the glare of the yellow eye shriveled the limbs as its killing wind shrivels young corn. Hideousness of its face transcended mere bestiality. It might have been the face of an ancient, evil mummy quickened with demonic life. In those abhorrent features, the outlaw's dilated eyes seemed like a shadow of madness that enveloped him, a faint and terrible resemblance to the slave Thothamon. Then Ascalante's cynical, all-sufficient philosophy deserted him. With a ghastly cry, he gave out the ghost before the shivering fangs touched him up. Conan, shaking, the blood drops from his eyes, stared frozen. At first, he thought the great black hound which stood above Ascalante's distorted body. Then his sight cleared, and he saw that it was neither a hound nor a baboon. With a cry that was like an echo from Ascalante's death shriek, he reeled away from the wall and met the leaping horror with the cast of his axe with all the desperate power of his electrified nerves. The weapon glanced, singing through the slanting skull it should have crushed. The king was hurled halfway across the room with the impact of the giant body. Slavering jaws closed on the arm of Conan, flung up to guard his throat, but the monster made no effort to secure a death grip. Over his mangled arm, it glared fiendishly into the king's eyes, in which it began mirrored a likeness of the horror which stared from the dead eyes of Ascalante. Conan felt his soul shrivel and begin to be drawn out of his body, to drown in the yellow wells of cosmic horror which glimmered spectrally from the formless chaos that was growing about him, engulfing all of his life and sanity. Those eyes became gigantic, and in them the Cimmerian glimpsed the reality and abysmal blasphemousness, horrors that lurk in the outer darkness of formless voids, nighted gulfs. He opened his bloody lips to shriek his hate and loathing, but a dry rattle burst from his throat. But the horror that paralyzed and destroyed Ascalante roused the Cimmerian, a frenzy akin to madness. With volcanic wrench, his whole body he plunged backwards, heedless of the agony of his torn arm, dragging the monstrous body with him. And his outflung hand struck something his dazed fighting brain recognized as the hilt of his broken sword. Instinctively, he gripped it and struck with all the power of nerve he threw, as a man stabs with a dagger. The broken blade sank deep, and Conan's arm was released from the abhorrent mouth, gaping in agony. The king hurled violently aside, and lifting himself onto one hand, saw, as one mazed, terrible convulsions of the monster from which thick blood was gushing through great wounds his blade had just torn. And he watched its struggle ceased as it lay jerking spasmodically, staring up from grisly dead eyes. Conan blinked, shaking more blood from his own eyes. It seemed to him as though the thing was melting and disintegrating into a slimy mess. Then a medley of voices reached his ears, and the room was thronged, finally roused with people of the court, knights, peers, ladies, men-at-arms, counselors, all babbling and shouting and getting in another's way. The black dragons were on hand, wild with rage, swearing and ruffling, with their hands on their hilts and their foreign oaths in their teeth. Of the young officer guarding the door was nothing seen, nor was found later, though earnestly sought after. Grommel. Volmana. Rinaldo, exclaimed Publius, the high counselor, wringing his fat hands among the corpses. Black treachery! Someone shall dance for this! Call the guards! The guard is here, you old fool! Cavalry snapped Pallantides, the commander of the Black Dragons, forgetting Publius's rank in the stress of the moment. Best stop your caterwauling and bind the king's wounds before he bleeds to death. Yes, yes, cried Publius. The man of plans was rather than action. We must bind his wounds, send for every leech in the court. Oh my lord, what a black shame on the city. Are you entirely slain? Wine, gasped the king from the couch where they had lain him. They put a tiny goblet to his lips, and he drank like a man half dead from thirst. Good, he grunted, falling back. Slaying is accursed dry work. They had staunched the flow of blood, and the innate vitality of the barbarian was asserting itself. See to the dagger wound in my side first, he bade the court physicians. Ronaldo wrote me a deathly song there, and keen was that stylus. We should have hanged him long ago, gibbered Publius. No good can come of poets. Who is this? He nervously touched Ascalante's body with his scandaled toe. By Mitra! Ejected the commander. It is Ascalante of Thune. By the devil's work, what's brought him from the desert haunts? But why does he stare so? Whispered Publius, drawing away, his eyes peculiarly pricking among the short hairs his fat neck. The others fell silent, gazed at the dead outlaw. Had you seen what I had saw, growled the king, sitting up at the dead prospects of the leeches, you'd have not wondered. Blast, Owen gazing by looking at it. He stopped short, mouth gaping, pointing fruitlessly where the monster had died. Only the bare floor met his eyes. By Crom! The thing's melted back into the foulness of which it bore. The king is delirious, whispered a nobleman. Conan heard and swore barbaric oaths. By Bob's Morrigan and Maca and Maine, he concluded wrathfully. I am sane. It was like a cross between a Stygian mummy and a baboon. It came through the door as Ascalante's rogues fled before it. It slew Ascalante, who was about to run through me. Then it came upon me, and I slew it. How, I know not, for my axe glanced from it. I think, but it was the sage, Epimetrius, had a hand in it. Hark! How he knows the name of Epimetrius, dead 1,500 years! They whispered amongst each other. By Ymir! Thundered the king. This night I talked with Epimetrius. He called to me in my dreams, and I walked down the black stone corridor carved with the old gods, to a stone stair in the steps of the outlines of Set, until I came upon a crypt, a tomb with a phoenix carved in it. In Mitra's name, Lord King, be silent! It was the high priest of Mitra, who called out. His countenance was ashen. Conan threw his head like a lion, tossing his manes, voice thick with a growl, angry. Am I a slave? Shut your mouth at my command! Nay, nay, my lord! The priest was trembling, but not through the fear. I meant no offense. He bent his head, close to the king, and spoke a whisper carried only to Conan's ears. My lord, this is a matter beyond human understanding. Only the inner circle of priestcraft know the black stone corridor carved the black heart of Mount Golomira in the unknown lands, or by the phoenix-guarded tomb where Epimetrius was laid to rest 1,500 years ago. And since that time, no living man has entered it, for his chosen priest, after placing the sage in the crypt, blocked the outer entrance of the corridor so that no man could find it. And today, not even the priests know where it is. Only by word of mouth, handed down by the priest to the chosen few, and jealously guarded, does the inner circle of Mitra's acolytes know this resting place of Epimetrius in the black heart of Golomira. It is one of the mysteries of which Mitra's cult stands. I cannot say by what magic Epimetrius brought me to him, answered Conan. But I talked with him, and he made his mark upon my sword. Why that mark made it deadly to demons, or what magic lay behind the mark, I know not. But I know the blade broke on Grommel's helmet, yet the fragment was still long enough to kill the horror. Let me see your sword, whispered the priest, his throat suddenly going dry. Conan held out the broken weapon, and the priest cried out and fell to his knees. Mitra, guard us against powers of darkness. The king indeed talked with Epimetrius this night. And there on the sword, the secret sign none might make but him, the emblem of the immortal phoenix broods over his tomb. A candle, quick! Look again, the spot where the king said the goblin died. It laid, shade-broken screen. They threw light, bathed the floor on candlelight, and shuddering silence fell as they looked. Then, on their knees calling to Mitra, some fled screaming from the chamber. There on the floor where the monster had died, there lay, like a tangible shadow, a broad, dark stain that could not be washed out. The thing had left its outline clearly etched in its blood, and that outline of being no sane and normal world. Grim and horrific, it brooded there, like the shadows cast by one of the apish gods that squat at the shadowy altars on the dim temples in the dark lands of Stygia.
I know the original plan today was to do all 3 stories. However, my voice is starting to go on me a little bit, so we are not going to be doing Scarlet Citadel. So thank you everybody who tuned in, and